And we welcome your testimony now.
Senator Lieberman, Senator Collins.
Could you hit that mic button, please?
I did. I just wasn't
There you
too close.
go.
Thank you.
Okay, it's direct.
Senator Lieberman, Senator Collins, thank you both for the opportunity to speak here today. I'd like to offer a few observations about the current Somali crisis, the role of the diaspora in Somalia, and the question of recruitment of diaspora youth into the extremist group Shabab. Somalia has been beset by one of the longest and most destructive crises in the post-Cold War era. The Somali people have endured 19 years of complete state collapse, civil war, chronic insecurity, and recurring humanitarian crises. An estimated 1 million Somalis are today refugees scattered across the globe. This has been an exceptionally traumatic period for the Somali people. Over the course of this long period of statelessness, Islamic institutions, charities, schools, Sharia courts, and political movements have helped to fill the vacuum left by the collapsed state. Somalis increasingly look to Islam as an answer to their plight. The ascendance of political Islam is an enduring trend in Somalia, and in general terms, this need not be viewed as a problem for or a threat to the United States. The period since 2006 has been especially violent and destructive. In 2006, an Islamic administration briefly arose in Mogadishu and for 6 months provided very impressive levels of public order. The Islamic Courts Union, or ICU, was very popular with Somalis as a result. Ultimately, hardliners in the ICU, including political figures commanding a small, committed militia known as the Shabab, marginalized political moderates in the Islamic movement and took actions which threatened the security of neighboring Ethiopia. With U.S. support, Ethiopia launched an offensive in December 2006, routing the ICU and militarily occupying the Somali capital, Mogadishu. Predictably, Somalis of all political persuasions deeply resented the Ethiopian occupation, and within weeks, an armed insurgency arose. The counterinsurgency by Ethiopian forces and the transitional federal government was very heavy-handed, and within months, Mogadishu was the site of a catastrophe. 700,000 residents of the city were displaced by the violence. Much of the capital was damaged, thousands died, and an epidemic of assassinations and assaults by all sides gripped the city. By 2008, the violence spread throughout the countryside. 3 million Somalis are now in need of humanitarian aid, prompting the UN to declare Somalia the world's worst humanitarian crisis. For our purposes, two important developments arose from this catastrophe. First, it generated an enormous amount of anger among Somalis, both at home and abroad. This has manifested itself in high levels of anti-Ethiopian, anti-American, anti-Western, and anti-UN sentiment. Second, one group, the hardline Islamist militia, the Shabab, emerged as the main source of armed resistance to the TFG and the Ethiopian occupation. Shabab successfully conflated its radical Islamist ideology with Somali nationalism. In the eyes of most Somalis, Shabab was a legitimate national resistance to a foreign occupation. Shabab was seen by many Somalis as freedom fighters, not terrorists, even by Somalis who found their radical policies appalling and their rumored links to al-Qaeda very worrisome. In March 2008, the U.S. declared Shabab a terrorist group. The many Somalis who had provided indirect or direct support to Shabab were thereby immediately criminalized. In May 2008, the U.S. launched a Tomahawk missile attack which killed the top Shabab leader, Aden Hashiaido. Thereafter, al-Shabab announced an intent to attack U.S., Western, and UN targets both inside and outside Somalia. Its principal focus remains the national struggle, but we are now formally a target of them as well. Shabab is today the strongest single armed group in the country, controlling territory from the Kenyan border to the outskirts of Mogadishu. It has links to al-Qaeda. But recent developments are working against Shabab. Ethiopia withdrew its forces from Somalia in December 2008. The unpopular TFG president Abdullahi Yusuf resigned in December of 2008. A new U.S. administration has taken office and is reviewing its policies on Somalia. And a peace accord known as the Djibouti process has forged a new governing alliance of moderates from the TFG and Islamist opposition, now led by President Sheikh Sharif. Shabab has been deprived of its main raison d'etre and now faces growing resistance from Somali militias allied with the new unity government. Shabab also faces internal divisions, including tensions between hardcore members and those who join the cause mainly to rid their country of a foreign occupation. Put another way, not all Shabab members are committed jihadists, making it problematic to label the entire group terrorists. Somalis who were willing to support Shabaab when it represented the main source of resistance to Ethiopian occupation appear uninterested in supporting Shabaab in its bid to grab power and impose its extremist policies on Somalia. Shabaab may well have hit its high water mark in 2008 and now faces declining support and possible defections. If so, this is good news. It would mean that the threat of Shabaab recruitment among the diaspora will be less a threat in the future. An assessment of the threat of terrorist recruitment among the Somali diaspora must start with an understanding of the diaspora's role in Somalia today. The principal role the diaspora has played over the past 20 years has been an economic lifeline to Somalia. Its remittances are by far and away the most important source of income in Somalia, estimated at $1 billion remitted to Somalia each year. It's fair to say...
Is that just from the U.S. or worldwide?
No, worldwide.
Yeah.
Worldwide. It is fair to say that the diaspora keeps much of Somalia alive. The diaspora is also pressured to contribute to communal fundraising, some of which is used for good causes like community projects. In other cases, the fundraising can support militias or even extremist groups like Shabaab. The diaspora does not always control how their money is used. Somali business, political, and civic life is increasingly dominated by the diaspora. An estimated 70% of the new TFG cabinet, for instance, holds citizenship abroad, and the new Prime Minister himself is a Canadian Somali who's resided for years in Virginia. In sum, Somalia has become a diasporized nation. Many Somalis with citizenship abroad return to Somalia often to visit family, check on business investments, manage nonprofits, or pursue political ambitions. This makes it increasingly difficult to draw meaningful distinctions between the Somalis and the Somali diaspora. Virtually every Somali enterprise, whether the shareholder group of the Coca-Cola bottling plant in Mogadishu, which is still working, or the new TFG administration or Shabaab itself, is likely to have a significant diaspora component. Extensive travel to Somalia and financial and other interactions by Somali Americans with their home country should not constitute, therefore, a high-risk profile. The Minneapolis case of Shira Ahmed and other youth who have been recruited into Shabaab raises a basic question that you have both asked this morning. Why would Shabaab actively recruit diaspora members? What can a diaspora recruit do that a local militia fighter cannot? First, it's clear that the diaspora are not much value as rank-and-file militia for the Shabaab or any other fighting force in Somalia. Somalia is already saturated with experienced teenage gunmen and has no need to import more. In fact, evidence from the ICU in 2006 suggests the Somali diaspora as well as foreign fighters were as much a liability as an asset. They were unfamiliar with the countryside, often spoke the Somali language poorly, were more likely to become sick, and required a fair amount of oversight. But the diaspora are useful to Shabaab and other armed groups in Somalia in other ways. Their familiarity with computers and the internet is a valuable communication skill. And to come to the point of our hearing, a young diaspora recruit is, upon arrival in Somalia, entirely cut off socially and therefore, in theory, easier to isolate, indoctrinate, and control for the purpose of executing suicide bombings. Were this not the case, it would be much less risky and expensive for Shabaab to simply recruit locals. From this perspective, a young diaspora member who heeds the call by a recruiter to join the cause of fighting to protect his nation and religion is not so much a terrorist as a pawn exploited by the real terrorists, those who are unwilling themselves to die for their cause, but who are happy to manipulate a vulnerable and isolated youth to blow himself up. In my assessment, a Somali diaspora member groomed to be a terrorist is of most utility to Shabaab for a suicide operation either inside Somalia or in the region of the Horn of Africa, Kenya, Djibouti, and especially now Ethiopia. The reason for this is that these recruits would need handlers both to help them navigate through unfamiliar situations and to ensure that they go through with the attack. I am much less convinced that Shabaab would be willing to risk sending a trained and indoctrinated diaspora member back to the U.S. as a sleeper for a future terrorist attack in the U.S. The risks to Shabaab would be enormous. They would not be in a position to easily manage and control their recruit. The recruit could even defect and provide damaging information on Shabaab to U.S. law enforcement. And even if Shabaab managed to send a totally committed recruit back to the U.S., a Shabaab-directed terrorist attack inside the U.S. would almost certainly have disastrous consequences for Shabaab, not only in terms of the U.S. response, but from Somali society as well. Recall that remittances from the diaspora are the economic lifeline of Somalia. Anything that jeopardizes the status of Somalis living abroad imperils the entire country, and Shabaab would face enormous blowback from within the Somali community. In sum, my sense is that the threat of an American of Somali descent joining Shabaab and then returning as a sleeper to the U.S. is quite low. The threat still requires careful law enforcement attention, but should not be overblown. There is one exception to this assessment: a Somali American who joins Shabaab and who is then proceeded to Pakistan or Afghanistan and who becomes an al-Qaeda operative is of much greater concern. The reasoning for this is straightforward. Shabaab's agenda is still essentially a nationalist one, while al-Qaeda's is global. Al-Qaeda would not weigh the costs of a terrorist attack in the U.S. on the Somali economy and the Somali diaspora, whereas Shabaab would. A Somali American acting through the ideological prism of al-Qaeda would be more willing to serve as a sleeper than would a Shabaab member. I'd like to conclude with just a few thoughts on the Somali experience with and response to law enforcement authorities, much of which has already been alluded to this morning. First, Somalis have a long and unhappy experience with the state and the police back in their country of origin. As a result, not all Somalis view the state, law enforcement, and the law as a source of protection and order. Some view law enforcement with fear as something to avoid. Behavior which appears to be evasive or untruthful can often be traced back to this generic fear of law enforcement and should not be misinterpreted. Sustained police programs to socialize Somali American communities and reshape their perception of the state and the law are essential if this is to be overcome. They need to appreciate the difference between rule of law and rule by law and feel confident that the U.S. law enforcement system reflects the former and not the latter. Some Somali households are likely to be nervous about any attention from law enforcement, not because of links to terrorism, but because of the risk that U.S. law enforcement will in the process uncover other irregularities, including illegal immigration, putting the community's interests at risk. All communities have their dominant narratives, and Somalis are no exception. Their dominant narrative is a story of victimization and persecution both at home and abroad. It's very easy for some in the Somali American community to interpret current U.S. law enforcement attention as yet another instance of witch hunting and persecution, reflecting a combination of anti-immigrant, anti-Muslim, anti-African sentiments. Some flatly deny there's a problem with Shabaab recruitment at all. The only way to produce better cooperation with this community is through routinized communication that builds trust with local law enforcement and which gives Somalis a clear sense not only of their legal and social obligations as citizens but also of their legal rights. The U.S. government needs to provide much clearer guidelines to Somalis about what constitutes legal and illegal behavior with regard to political engagement in their country of origin. If not, we run the risk of criminalizing routine diaspora engagement in Somalia. The fact that Shabaab was not designated a terrorist organization before March 2008, but then was so designated, is an example of the legal confusion facing Somalis. Something that was legal in February 2008 is now aiding and abetting terrorism. As you know, this is a question of relevance to many other immigrant communities in the U.S. whose country of origin is embroiled in war or whose charities have come under suspicion of serving as terrorist fronts. The U.S. government cannot ask its citizens to abide by the law if the laws themselves are too opaque to be understood, and this is especially the case if legal charges can be made retroactively for affiliations with groups which were acceptable in the past but then designated terrorist. Finally, it goes without saying that the main responsibility for policing Somali youth to ensure they do not become members of criminal gangs or terrorist groups falls squarely on the shoulders of Somali parents and community leaders. To the extent that Somali communities need additional outside support to provide for a safe and controlled environment for their children to grow up, we should try to provide it. Most importantly, we need to ensure that first-generation Somali Americans are growing up with a strong sense of being American citizens with all the rights and responsibilities that entails. A Somali diaspora population that feels it belongs neither here nor in Somalia will be much more susceptible to radical movements promising their own sense of identity and purpose. I hope these brief observations are of help to you as you exercise oversight on a topic with both important implications for national security and civil liberties. Like many U.S. citizens, I was greatly moved by President Obama's promise and in his inaugural speech. We reject as false the choice between our safety and our ideals. I'm confident that we can address the security concerns raised by Somali American recruitment into Shabaab without violating their civil rights and those of the community. Thank you.
Thank you. I agree. That was very helpful. I'll have questions for you in the Q&A period, but let me just baseline ask you to give the committee a sense of the size of the global Somali diaspora as compared to the population in Somalia.
Our estimates of the global Somali population are about 1 million. out of a total Somali population of Somali citizenship, not the 4 million who are Ethiopian Somalis and 400,000 who are Kenyan Somalis,
Right.
Of about 9 to 10 million. So roughly 1 in 10 or more are abroad now.
Okay, thanks very much.